I've replayed that moment 1,000 times. The lighting in that restaurant, the way the candles flickered across the table, the soft hum of conversation surrounding us like white noise. I can still see his face, confident, unhurried, completely unbothered by my presence, as he leaned across the table and asked my girlfriend if she'd like to have dinner with him. Just the two of them. Somewhere nicer than this, he said, with a smile that suggested he already knew the answer. And she said yes. Not after a pause. Not with hesitation or a nervous glance in my direction. She laughed. This light, airy laugh I used to think was reserved only for me, and said, "I'd really like that." I sat there holding a glass of water like a prop in someone else's story. My name is Owen. I'm 31 years old, a civil engineer who designs drainage systems for a living. Not glamorous, but honest work that I've always been proud of. My girlfriend at the time was Priya. We'd been together for 2 years and 8 months. I know the exact number because we used to celebrate each month with takeout from the Thai place near her apartment, a tradition she started, and that I found quietly, completely endearing. Her boss was a man named Vincent. He ran a boutique architecture firm downtown, the kind of office with exposed brick, reclaimed wood desks, and employees who all seemed to dress like they were perpetually on their way to an art opening. Vincent was 43, divorced, successful in the way that fills a room before a person even walks into it. He wore his confidence the way other men wear cologne, too much of it, and you could smell it from across the table. That night had been billed as a casual work dinner. Priya's firm had collaborated with mine on a small commercial project, which is how Vincent and I had ended up at the same table in the first place. 2 colleagues, their teams, some wine, some bread, some polite professional conversation. That was supposed to be the whole of it. I had no reason to feel threatened walking in. Priya and I were solid, or so I believed. We'd talked about moving in together. We'd done the families thing, the awkward holiday dinners and summer barbecues. Her younger sister called me by a nickname. Her mother asked my opinion on things. I thought we were building something real. I realize now that I had confused the architecture of a relationship with its foundation. We had the walls up, the roof on, the furniture arranged. But somewhere underneath, the ground had been shifting for months, and I had been too comfortable to notice. The dinner started normally enough. There were 8 of us at the table, a mix from both firms. I was seated across from Priya, which I remember thinking was slightly odd, but I didn't push it. Vincent sat beside her. I watched him pour her wine before the server could get to it. I noticed, and then I let the noticing go, because I was trying not to be the kind of man who reads threats into every courteous gesture. The conversation flowed easily. Architecture and engineering have enough overlap that the professional talk didn't feel forced. I made a few jokes that landed. I talked about a project I was proud of. I felt present, engaged, like a functioning member of a dinner party, rather than someone quietly auditioning to be considered worth keeping. Then the table conversation splintered into smaller threads, the way it does toward the end of a meal. And in one of those quieter moments, while the colleague to my left was on his phone and the 2 women across the table were laughing about something, Vincent turned to Priya with the kind of deliberateness that only happens when someone has been waiting for a window. He looked at her first, then he looked at me. It wasn't a mistake or an oversight. He held my gaze for a full second, long enough to make sure I was watching, and then he turned back to Priya and said, "I've been meaning to tell you. There's a new gallery opening on Archer Street next Friday. I think you'd love it. Come with me." Not a question, really. More of an announcement dressed as an invitation. Priya smiled at him, and there was something in that smile I hadn't seen in a long time. Or maybe I had seen it, but not directed at me. She said, "I'd really like that," and touched his arm briefly. The way you touch someone when you want them to know the warmth behind your words is genuine. I looked down at the tablecloth. I don't know how long I stared at the pattern on that cloth. It felt like minutes. It was probably 4 seconds. When I looked up, the conversation had moved on. Priya was laughing again. Vincent was talking to someone else. The candles were still flickering. The restaurant hadn't noticed that my understanding of my own life had just rearranged itself completely. I said nothing. I stayed for the rest of the dinner. I split the bill with my colleague. I hugged Priya in the parking lot and told her I'd call her tomorrow. I drove home, sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes, and stared at nothing. Here is what I've come to understand about silence. It is not always the absence of something. Sometimes silence is the fullest thing in the room. That night, my silence wasn't cowardice, though I spent months convincing myself it was. It was something more complicated. It was the sound of a man realizing that whatever he says next will not change what he just witnessed. Because Vincent hadn't done something wrong. Exactly. He'd asked a woman to an art gallery. That's not a crime. What undid me wasn't the asking. It was her answer, and, more than that, the ease of it. There was no discomfort on her face, no quick look in my direction that said, "Is this okay?" Or even "Sorry about this." She just said yes, like the most natural thing in the world, like I wasn't sitting 3 feet away. That's when I understood. The distance wasn't 3 feet. It was much wider than that. I called my best friend Theo the next morning. Theo is the kind of person who delivers hard truths in a voice so calm and steady that you don't realize you've been told something devastating until an hour after the conversation. I told him what happened. There was a pause. "What did Priya say afterward?" he asked. "In the parking lot?" "Nothing about it." Another pause. "And you didn't bring it up?" "No." "Owen," he said, and that was it. Just my name, but weighted with everything neither of us wanted to say. I knew, even before I called him, what the conversation needed to be. I just hadn't been ready to have it yet. Calling Theo was my way of loading up for something I already knew I had to face. I waited 2 days before I talked to Priya. I needed the time not to build a case, but to figure out what I actually wanted to know. There's a trap men fall into during these conversations. We go in with evidence and arguments when what we really need are honest answers. I'd learnt that lesson before the hard way, in a relationship years earlier. I wasn't going to prosecute. I was going to ask. We met at her apartment on a Sunday afternoon. She'd made tea. She always made tea when she sensed something difficult was coming, as if the ritual of it could soften whatever followed. We sat at her kitchen table, the one we'd assembled together from a flat-pack box on a rainy afternoon 2 years ago, laughing at the instructions. I asked her directly, "What's going on with Vincent?" She didn't play dumb. I'll give her that, and I've given her that many times since. She looked at me across the table with an expression I can only describe as tired, not of me, but of the version of herself that had been delaying this moment, and she said, "I don't know how to explain it without hurting you." "Then just explain it," I said. She did. It hadn't started as anything, she said. She'd worked closely with Vincent on a project that ran well over a year, long hours, high stakes, the kind of proximity that either destroys professional relationships or builds something else entirely. She said she'd tried to ignore it. She'd talked herself out of it multiple times. But something had shifted in recent months, and she hadn't been honest with herself about what that meant for us. "Did anything happen?" I asked. "No," she said, and I believed her. I still believe her. "But you wanted it to." She didn't answer. Which was its own answer? I sat with that for a moment. The tea cooled between us. I thought about the Thai place and the monthly dinners, and her sister's nickname for me, and all the ordinary, accumulating evidence of a life shared. I thought about how none of that had been fake. She hadn't been lying to me about loving me, I don't think. People can love you and still outgrow you. That's possibly the most devastating thing I've ever learned. "I think I need to know," I said finally, "whether you still want this. Us." She looked at me with her eyes full, and she said, "I don't want to hurt you." That's not what I asked. She looked away, out the window, toward the street. A long silence settled between us, like snowfall, quiet, covering everything. "I don't know," she said at last, "and I think that means I already know." We broke up that afternoon. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no door slamming, no accusations hurled across the room. We just sat at that table she and I had built together, and we acknowledged that what we'd been building had somewhere, quietly, come to an end. I drove home a second time in 2 days and sat in my car in the driveway. The weeks that followed were among the worst of my adult life, not because of anger, which would have been easier, but because of grief. Pure, uncomplicated grief. I missed her constantly, the small daily versions of her, the way she'd read articles aloud to me over breakfast, her habit of narrating television episodes before they ended, her insistence on doing the dishes immediately after cooking so the kitchen stayed clean. I missed being known. I missed the comfort of being someone's person. I also, I'll admit, spent time with some darker thoughts. I wondered what I lacked. I measured myself against Vincent, his success, his ease, his complete indifference to my presence at that table, and I came up wanting. I questioned my instincts, my choices, whether I'd been naive to feel as secure as I had. I went through a period where every past kindness Priya had shown me became evidence I re-examined for hidden meaning. That was a miserable way to live, and it took me longer than I'm proud of to stop doing it. Theo sat through a lot of phone calls during those months. So did my brother, Callum, who had gone through his own difficult ending a few years prior and understood without needing everything explained. There's a particular comfort in being around people who've been broken and rebuilt themselves. They don't flinch at your mess. They've made their own. I want to talk about what came after the mess, because I think that's the part people rarely tell. About 4 months out, I started running. Not for the noble reasons people claim, stress relief, health, discipline, but because I didn't know what to do with my evenings, and movement felt better than stillness. I started doing 3 kilometers, then 5, then 8. Eventually, I signed up for a half marathon that a colleague mentioned, mostly to give myself a deadline that had nothing to do with heartbreak. Running did something I hadn't expected. It gave me back my relationship with my own body, with my own effort, my own capacity. Every kilometer I completed was evidence of something I'd done entirely by myself, for myself, accountable to nothing but my own lungs and legs. After months of feeling passive, like something that had been acted upon rather than someone who acts, it mattered more than I can adequately describe. I also threw myself into work in a way I hadn't done since my mid-20s. I volunteered for a complex municipal infrastructure project. Unglamorous, technically demanding, politically complicated. I worked long hours. I collaborated closely with a team I came to respect deeply. I found that the version of myself who existed at work, competent, precise, trusted, was still intact even when the personal version felt unstable. That steadied me. I'm not suggesting work is a cure for loss. It isn't. But identity is a distributed thing, and when one part collapses, the parts that remain can hold you up while you rebuild. I did not speak to Priya for almost 8 months. Then she texted me on a Thursday evening. Nothing remarkable, just a photo of the Thai place near her apartment with the message, "They finally updated the menu. Thought you'd want to know." I stared at that message for a long time. I thought about what it meant that she'd sent it. I thought about what it meant that I felt something warm upon receiving it, rather than something bitter. I wrote back, "Did they keep the green curry?" She replied, "Obviously. Some things are sacred." We met for dinner 2 weeks later. Not romantic. Both of us were clear about that, internally if not explicitly. Just 2 people who had been important to each other, trying to figure out what shape the remaining connection should take. It was awkward at first, the way these things always are when you're navigating the geography of a new dynamic. But Priya is a person I genuinely like, separate from the history and the hurt. That hadn't disappeared. She told me things had not worked out with Vincent, which she said without any particular expectation of how I'd receive it, and I received it without the satisfaction I might have expected to feel. What I felt instead was a kind of quiet recognition that she had followed something real, and it hadn't led where she hoped, and that was just life. Life does that. We are not close friends, but we are friendly. We see each other occasionally, exchange occasional messages, wish each other well with what I believe is genuine feeling on both sides. That feels like an adult outcome. Imperfect, slightly sad around the edges, but honest. I am not the same person who sat frozen at that restaurant table. I've thought hard about what that silence meant, not as evidence of weakness, which is how I read it for a long time, but as a moment of profound disorientation. When your understanding of your life is suddenly and publicly revised, you go quiet. That's not failure. That's being human. What I carried out of that silence, eventually, was a clearer understanding of what I needed and what I was willing to accept. I'd been so invested in the life Priya and I had built together that I'd stopped paying attention to whether that life still fit us both. I'd confused consistency with health. I'd mistaken the absence of conflict for the presence of connection. I'm more honest now, with the people I'm close to and with myself. I ask harder questions earlier. I don't build assumptions out of routines. I try to stay awake to the actual state of things rather than the story I'm telling myself about the state of things. I met someone about a year after Priya and I broke up. Her name is Nadia. She's a landscape architect. There's an irony in that, I know. And she is the most direct person I have ever known. She says what she means. She asks for what she needs. She disagrees with me when she disagrees with me, and she does it in plain language without drama. The first time she pushed back on something I said, firmly and without apology, I remember thinking, this is what I want. This is what honest looks like. We are not without our difficulties. No relationship is. But there is a quality of presence between us, a mutual attentiveness to the actual state of things, that I didn't know I was missing until I found it. I think about Vincent occasionally. I don't hate him. He didn't do anything to me, not really. He pursued someone he was drawn to. He was honest about his intentions in the most conspicuous way imaginable. He looked right at me so I couldn't miss it, which is its own strange form of transparency. What he did was show me something I needed to see. That night in the restaurant, I thought my silence was a failure. Standing there, watching something happen that I didn't know how to stop, feeling the cold certainty of my own irrelevance. But silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's the moment before the question that changes everything. And the question, what is actually true here? What do I actually want? What am I actually building and with whom? Was one I needed to sit with until I could answer it honestly. The answer took time. The answer was uncomfortable. The answer required me to grieve a version of my life I'd been attached to, and to let it go without resentment. I finished that half marathon in 2 hours and 14 minutes on a cold morning in November, Theo and Callum shouting from the side of the road in matching ridiculous scarves they'd bought as a bit. I crossed the line with my lungs burning and my legs complaining, and I stood there in the aftermath, chest heaving, eyes stinging, inexplicably emotional in the way that physical exhaustion sometimes cracks you open. And I felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely and uncomplainingly myself. That's where the story ends, not with a revelation or a romance or a villain receiving his due. Just a man on a cold street, breathing hard, knowing exactly where he stands. This time, that knowledge felt like enough.